Today I want to talk about the future of Chinese air power, specifically how the People's Liberation Army understands air warfare, how it believes air power is changing, and how that thinking is being translated into the organisation's future force structure. To do that properly, we need to start with a basic premise. China does not see air power the same way Western air forces traditionally have. The PLA is not attempting to recreate the United States Air Force, but with a red star on the side. Instead, it is building something fundamentally different. An air power model that is deeply integrated with missiles, space systems and information warfare, and one that places far more emphasis on systems confrontation than on individual platforms. In Chinese military writing, air warfare is not defined by aircraft alone. It is instead defined by systems confrontation. Modern war, in the PLA's view, is a contest between opposing operational systems rather than between individual platforms or services. Aircraft, missiles, satellites, sensors, and command networks are valuable only to the extent that they contribute to a wider system capable of detecting targets, making decisions, and delivering effects faster than the enemy can respond. This is why Chinese doctrinal texts increasingly avoid treating aircraft as the decisive element of air power in isolation. As a result, the PLA does not frame air superiority as a permanent condition to be achieved and maintained. Instead, it focuses on the idea of functional or local control of the air. The objective is not to destroy every enemy aircraft, but to deny the opponent the ability to use air power effectively at decisive moments. That distinction is crucial. It tells us that the future Chinese Air Force is not being optimized for classic air dominance campaigns, but for short, violent windows of advantage created through system disruption. This way of thinking becomes especially clear when we look at how Chinese analysts interpret the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. PLA commentators were not primarily shocked by Russia's failure to achieve total air superiority. Instead, they focused on how modern air defense systems, electronic warfare, and dispersed basing prevented either side from freely operating in contested airspace. From the PLA's perspective, Ukraine confirms that air superiority is no longer binary. It is fragmented, localized, and temporary. Even powerful air forces can be denied freedom of action if their information networks are degraded or their aircraft are forced to operate under constant threat. More importantly, Chinese analysts emphasize that modern air warfare is inseparable from information warfare. Surveillance, targeting, jamming, deception, and command and control attacks now shape the air battle just as much as missiles and fighters do. The conclusion the PLA draws is not that aircraft are obsolete, but that aircraft operating outside a protected, integrated system are increasingly vulnerable and increasingly ineffective. This leads directly into one of the central pillars of future Chinese air power. For more than 2 decades, Chinese doctrine has emphasized airspace integration. Initially, this concept focused on using space systems to support air operations through navigation, communication, and reconnaissance. Over time, however, this idea has evolved into something far more ambitious. Today, PLA authors treat space as a contested warfighting domain rather than a passive enabler. Future air campaigns, in their view, will begin with efforts to disrupt or degrade the enemy's space-based systems, including satellites that provide intelligence, targeting, and command connectivity. Air power, therefore, is not expected to open the conflict alone. It arrives as part of a broader joint campaign that includes cyber operations, counter-space actions, and missile strikes, all aimed at blinding the enemy before sustained air operations even begin. This is why the modernization of the PLA Air Force cannot be understood in isolation from China's investment in space control and information forces. Another defining feature of Chinese thinking about future air power is the central role assigned to missiles. Unlike Western air forces, which historically relied on manned aircraft as the primary means of delivering combat effects, the PLA treats missiles as co-equal participants in aerospace warfare. In some scenarios, missiles are viewed as the preferred option. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, long-range air defense systems, and air-launched weapons are all described in Chinese doctrine as components of a unified aerospace strike system rather than as separate categories of capability. This has major implications. In a future conflict, Chinese air power would likely focus less on aerial combat between fighters and more on rapidly degrading the enemy's ability to operate. That means attacking airfields, tanker aircraft, airborne early warning platforms, command nodes, and logistics hubs, often through coordinated missile and airstrikes. Aircraft are still critical, but they are increasingly seen as sensors, coordinators, and enablers rather than the sole delivery mechanism for force. Chinese writing on future air warfare also places heavy emphasis on unmanned systems, but not in the sense of simply replacing pilots with drones. PLA authors consistently argue for manned-unmanned teaming. In this model, unmanned platforms extend sensor coverage, absorb risk, conduct reconnaissance, and complicate enemy defenses, while manned aircraft retain responsibility for command, judgment, and complex decision-making. Unmanned aircraft are expected to play a key role in saturating air defenses, conducting electronic warfare, acting as decoys, and enabling manned platforms to strike from safer distances. Losses among unmanned systems are considered acceptable if they degrade the enemy's operational system. This reflects a broader Chinese preference for attrition at the system level rather than at the platform or personal level. Perhaps the most forward-looking concept shaping Chinese air power is what the PLA refers to as intelligentized warfare. In Chinese military theory, intelligentization refers to the use of artificial intelligence, automation, and advanced data fusion to accelerate decision-making across the force. The goal is not simply better weapons, but faster and more reliable sensor-to-shooter loops that compress the time available for an adversary to react. In future air combat, success is expected to depend less on individual pilot skill and more on the ability of the system to process information, identify targets, and coordinate strikes faster than the enemy can respond. The ultimate aim is cognitive dominance. By overwhelming the opponent's ability to observe, orient, decide, and act, the PLA hopes to win the air battle before it fully manifests. Quick caveat, I know intelligentization is not a word in the English language. We're dealing with the closest possible translation of the Chinese word ji nang hua, which I apologize for butchering, but essentially just means making something smarter. Anyway, back to the video. When we pull these threads together, a clear picture begins to emerge of what Chinese air power is becoming. It is not an air force optimized for global expeditionary warfare or prolonged overseas operations. It is not designed primarily for air policing or long-duration presence missions. Instead, it is a force structured for regional, high-intensity conflict, particularly in the Western Pacific. It is designed to fight jointly with missile forces, space systems, and information units in order to impose early systems paralysis on an adversary. Its strength lies in its integration rather than individual platforms. Its weaknesses, as Chinese analysts themselves acknowledge, include limited combat experience, challenges in realistic joint training, and a command culture that is still adapting to the demands of fast-moving, information-centric warfare. Even so, the direction of travel is unmistakable. As discussed, Chinese doctrinal writings suggest that the PLAF does not view its future backbone as a single next-generation aircraft, but as a layered mix of platforms designed to operate as part of an integrated aerospace system. Rather than replacing older aircraft wholesale, the PLA anticipates a force structure in which different generations and types of platforms coexist, each optimized for a specific role within a system of systems warfare. At the core of this force into the 2030s will be advanced 4th and 5th generation manned combat aircraft. Chinese authors consistently emphasize the continued relevance of manned fighters for complex decision-making, command of unmanned systems, and operations in highly dynamic combat environments. Stealth aircraft are viewed as particularly important, not simply for penetration, but for their ability to survive long enough in contested battle spaces to act as sensors, coordinators, and information nodes within the broader operational system. Alongside these aircraft, Chinese doctrine places growing importance on large support platforms, including airborne early warning and control aircraft, electronic warfare aircraft, and long-range reconnaissance platforms. These assets are described as force multipliers whose loss would significantly degrade the effectiveness of frontline combat units. Protecting, dispersing, and redundantly replacing these enablers is therefore treated as the central operational challenge in future air campaigns. In this sense, the People's Liberation Army Air Force's future backbone is best understood not as a platform, but as an architecture. Understanding the future of Chinese air power matters because it shapes how wars in the Indo-Pacific would begin. The PLA is not planning for a slow, attritional air campaign. It is planning for rapid escalation, early systems disruption, and the creation of decisive advantages before an opponent can fully mobilize their strengths. Whether this approach would succeed in practice remains an open question, but it is a coherent and internally consistent theory of modern air warfare, grounded in careful study of recent conflicts and sustained doctrinal development. Ignoring it would be a serious mistake. If there is one key takeaway from Chinese writing on future air warfare, it is this. The PLA believes that decisive battles will be fought in networks, not in the sky alone. Aircraft still matter, pilots still matter, but but the side that controls information, integration, and tempo will shape the outcome long before the last missile is fired. And that, more than stealth fighters or hypersonic weapons, is the real story of China's future air power. If you found this useful, or at least mildly less wrong than most defense takes on the internet, please consider liking and subscribing. It would help me a lot. Fair winds and following seas. Thank you. Thank you guys for sticking around. Real quick, I'd like to give a huge shout out to the members of the channel: Mr. Cheese, Neon No One, Sweaty Giddy, Wester 42, Egg Benny, Shella Yoshi, Intelligenting, Jake Shippard, and Deepie. Thank you all so much. If you guys would like to become members of the channel, you get access to all of my Certified Legend podcast episodes and some behind the scenes posts that are otherwise not available. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a lovely day.